My name's Peter Torrey. I retired a couple of years ago as the executive pastor at Purpose Church in Pomona, which used to be First Baptist Church of Pomona. And after retiring, I've been on the board of Transformation Ministries for on and off for I don't know how many years. But I became involved with their church health team, and I help as a volunteer with Mark, helping churches with all sorts of issues. But my area of focus tends to be in the area of administrative issues, including security. Purpose Church was a church that would have about 3,000 people on a campus of about 15 acres on Sunday morning, and so we would deal with all sorts of various security issues, and it was part of my job to make sure that the campus was safe and secure. And so that's why I've become much more involved in that as time has gone along. Add to not only that past experience, but the simple fact that we're hearing more and more and more about problems with security on church campuses. And it's one of those things where you think, well, it will never happen here. And there's a Jewish synagogue in Pennsylvania thought that it would never happen here. There's a church in Sutherland, Texas that thought it will never happen here, but it happened. And so it's really important for us to make sure that our campuses are safe and secure. What we're going to do today is I'm going to start kind of with a broad picture of safety and security and talk about how we tend to approach it. My partner and I tend to approach safety and security. My partner, by the way, Chuck Rogers, is a former employee of World Vision and was Director of International Security for World Vision. So he comes with some pretty nice credentials in the area of security. But we'll take kind of a large, big picture look, and then we'll focus in on watching out for our children. So if you think, well, I came to hear more about children, that'll be the second half of this. But the first half is important because we'll be dealing with bigger issues, with kind of the bigger risks that a church can face. And every risk to a church at large is a risk to its children. Okay, so this first half, while we won't talk a lot specifically about children, it has to do with protecting the children as well. So we just want to get started. So one of the first things that we talk about when we do church security is the importance of having an awareness and establishing a safety committee. And if your church does not have a safety committee or a security committee, something along those lines that is concerned about the security of your church, you need to prevail upon your leadership to make sure that you get that. So let me just encourage you to do that. And people will say to me, but how do we start a safety and security committee? Well, the first thing is to get leadership on board. And this is, again, one of those areas where a lot of leadership thinks we've got so many other things to do. And it's just so hard to get people to volunteer. But it's really critical that leadership gets on board and supports this. You've got to pick people with the right character. A lot of people think all we need is to get some retired policemen or retired military, those kinds of people, on our safety committee and just let it go. And while it's good to have some of those kinds of people on your safety committee, if that's all that you've got on your safety committee, you aren't doing the full job. You need people with wisdom and maturity, people who have a spiritual concern and care for other people, and so forth. Often a church will ask us, well, can you give us kind of a list of the characteristics of who should be on our safety committee? And we actually have a list that we'll give to them, but we explain that this list basically describes Jesus, and we know that he's not here in your church right now, so you aren't going to quite make this list, but you get as close as you can. Pick the right number of people. You don't want a huge safety committee, but you want enough to be able to cover the ground. You want to assess your church's exposure, and I'll be talking about how to do an assessment in just a minute. And then you want to train. This is one of the mistakes that a lot of churches make. They get a committee set up and say, you're responsible for safety and security. Good luck. And just let it roll. And that just is not a wise thing to do. So you train them, you assign and deploy them, put them to work, and then you train them some more. And that's really what you want to be doing. You want to keep them active and keep them updated and so forth with everything that is going on in the world today. There are all sorts of issues and areas in which they can train. Just a couple of weekends ago, I went over to Phoenix to a training workshop. And it was a training workshop that really focused in on dealing more with the violent intruder and that sort of thing. And I have much more expertise in more of the policy and that area, that kind of background area. And I just needed to get more training. And you really want to make sure that your safety and security committee is trained. Then you want to do a safety and security review. And this is really, really important. It's amazing what you see if you actually go looking for it. And the problem that most churches have is that people are very familiar with the church and they don't see a lot of the risks that exist at their church. And it's almost imperative. You can have your safety and security committee do a review, but it's almost imperative to get some outside eyes looking at your campus to see things that the people that are very familiar with your campus will not see. And that's one of the things that my partner and I do. We're doing it with a number of TM churches, Transformation Ministries churches. We'll come to a campus and we'll spend a couple of hours just walking the campus with their leadership, their safety committee, and we'll just be looking. And it's amazing the things that you will see that a lot of other people won't see. One of the things that I often do when I'm on a church campus, and I'll warn our cameraman I'm going to move, I will, when we come into the children's area, I want to see it from a little different perspective. So you know what I do? I do this. I get down on my hands and knees and I crawl around, because that's what the children are seeing. And most people never think about the fact that it's what the children are seeing that can be dangerous to the children. And inevitably, I will find wires from a television monitor that are hanging down, plugs that aren't covered, shelves that have toys on them just out of the reach of children. And so what are they apt to do if they see one of those toys and they want to get it? They're going to climb, exactly. And when they go to climb, if that thing isn't fastened, guess where it's going? Right over on top of the child. So that's why it's so important to have outside, fresh eyes looking at your campus, because they will see some things that nobody else will see. And it's just a very important thing. One of the other things that we do is, when we do this survey, we will do this review, we will do a survey, and we will ask all sorts of things about the church. Does the church have in place any of the following? A security team selected on the basis of specific criteria, a comprehensive plan that covers multiple threats and risks, designed evacuation routes and exits, and do you conduct periodic evacuation drills? Not just in your children's area, but in your worship center, throughout the whole church. If you have not had an evacuation drill, you're asking for difficulties. You just are. Do you have shelter-in-place safe rooms with door locks and no windows? Do you have a campus perimeter spotters and early warning systems? Policies for dealing with suspicious people. Policies pertaining to staff safety while on campus during the week. A lot of safety committees think only about Sunday. There's all sorts of things that can happen during the week. Electronic locks on doors to the church office. Policies for dealing with transients or distraught visitors. Minimizing the amount of cash on hand during the week. If people think that your church has a bunch of cash on hand during the week, that's not a real good thing. A panic button that sends a silent alarm to the pastor and other staff. Periodic interaction with local law enforcement. Have leadership from your church ever gone to the local police station and just talked with them about security, about how to protect the campus, and that sort of thing? Very important. Closed-circuit TV positioned strategically throughout the campus. Now that's kind of a pricey thing, and we don't necessarily recommend it for every church, but if a church campus is really spread out, something like this can be very, very helpful. Two-way radios for prompt inter-staff communications, code words to covertly communicate possible problems, internal controls pertaining to the handling of the offering and other cash, your counting committee, banking, and bookkeeping. This is another one of those areas where people say, well, we don't have to worry about that. We have wonderful people taking care of this and so forth. We never really need to give it a second thought. But you need to protect the people that are doing that and making sure that you've got the right policies in place so that they are protected. A child protection program, which includes a two-person policy and other policies concerning who is authorized to work with children. And I'll talk more about some of those policies a little later on. Blueprints in all church buildings with accompanying photos. And you may say, well, why should the safety committee have that? They need to know where it is, because if you have a fire, if you have an earthquake and so forth, if you've got those, it can be very, very helpful to have them for first responders. An automated external defibrillator and staff trained in its use. Most churches these days are, a lot of churches do not have them. Many churches are beginning to get them. It's absolutely imperative that you get them. It is becoming considered best practice to have AEDs on your campus. And the problem, if you don't, is that if somebody goes down with a heart attack and you don't have an AED and they pass away or are completely incapacitated, then you're opening yourself for a lawsuit because it's become considered best practice. And they're a little pricey. They're $1,200 to $1,500 depending on the model. You can usually find them in that range. But you need to have them, and you need to have them where they're available. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. Do you have in your congregation active or retired law enforcement professionals? If so, you need to identify them. Even if they don't choose to serve, on the Safety and Security Committee, you need to identify and know who they are. Because in certain circumstances and situations, they're going to jump into action anyway. So you need to know who they are. Greeters and ushers trained to deal with suspicious or unruly visitors. Do you have people greeting people in the parking areas or before they get inside the building? Because once they're inside the building, it's harder to deal with them. If you can deal with suspicious or unruly visitors outside of the building, you're in a much, much better position, especially if children are in the same building as the main worship center. Because now, if a suspicious or unruly person gets into that building, they've got access not only to the adults, they also have access to the children. You don't want them there, okay? Motion or heat sensors installed in trap areas. That's hallways where thieves must walk or could hide. We were at a church recently, and they had kind of an enclosed patio. And in this enclosed patio, there was a section that had a lot of bushes, and the patio had pretty much open access to a main street. And we're looking at that saying, okay, if I were a homeless person, or if I wanted to stick around and see if there were a few people, 2 or 3 people here by themselves late at night where I could get a little bit of money, where could I hide? Right behind those bushes. So, if you have lighting or heat sensors or motion sensors in some of those areas that come on and alert people, all the better. And also inside, because sometimes there are hallways inside where people can hide, and it's just, they'll get in there and they'll stay there. Do you have a limited number of church keys? And do you know who has your keys? That's one of those ones where you say, good luck, because there's a whole lot of churches and they don't have a clue who all has keys, because they've been giving them out for years. And if that's the case, my recommendation is, okay, you start making a list of everybody that you know that has them, and you start making sure that you start now keeping track of them. And at some point, you may even consider changing locks and making it more secure. Secured children's areas in the nursery, the Sunday school, children's church, and so forth. Does your church have in place sexual harassment training and policies for dealing with sexual harassment? Now, here's something that's really important. I haven't digested the entire law yet, but California just recently passed a law that every employer has to provide sexual harassment training for every employee. Doesn't matter if they're full-time, part-time. Doesn't matter if they're seasonal, temporary. They've got to provide it. At least 1 hour every 2 years. And it applies to everybody. Churches? Churches too. Now, at first, we get that reaction. But this is not a difficult thing to do. You can go online and get the training online relatively inexpensively. If you get them for a number of people, you can usually get them to lower the price some and get it down to somewhere between $15 to $25 a person. And you're doing it every 2 years, not every year. Supervisors need 2 hours. And so my encouragement is, this is not a super big deal, but it's important to do. Finally, do you have policy regarding who may speak for the church to the press or media? If there were a situation happened in your church, a negative situation, you don't want just anybody going out and talking to the media, because if they say the wrong things, it'll hurt your church overall. So you want to make sure that you have people who you have assigned and who you know and can trust to be discreet but honest in how they communicate to the media. Now, these are some of the things that we will talk about as we are walking the campus in a review. And we'll talk about much more as we see different things that need to be addressed. Let me just say that there are many ways to do a review, a safety review of your campus. You can do it with just the committee. But as I said before, outside fresh eyes will see things that your committee won't see because they're very familiar with everything. You can get a lot of your insurance companies will provide somebody that will come to the campus and just as part of their insurance service will walk the campus and do a safety review. Those will tend to focus more on things like trip and fall safety things. They'll find the plug that's not covered or the shelf that could come over. They will tend not too often to talk about how do you deal with panhandlers or what do you do with a violent intruder or a suspicious person and things like that. Some will, but not all of them. You can ask for law enforcement to do a review for you. And some police departments are happy to have an officer come out and look at your campus and so forth. Others not so happy to do that, so that kind of depends on where you're located. They will tend to focus more on things like, is your campus, do you have exposures for break-ins, do you have exposures for people to hide outside and some things like that. So they'll tend to focus a little bit more that direction. Security companies will also focus more in that area and how to deal with violent intruders and so on and so forth. My partner Chuck and myself, we try to cover everything, and Chuck has background as a security director for World Vision, and I have background of watching over security for a 3,000 member church. So we tend to look at a broader scope. But you want to, whatever you do, any review will start you on the way and will be helpful. You don't have to solve every security problem the first time you have a review. If you solve one or two things, you've made some progress. And so don't hesitate and say, well, I don't know if we can do a review with the, if the best thing you can do is get your security committee, safety committee, doing a walk through your campus and looking for areas of exposure, that's a great start. Just do that. Now what we tend to do is we will take a graph that has probability and impact. Probability should be going up and down the vertical axis. Impact is that axis. And as we review a church, we will figure out what are the main risks that a church has, and then we'll put them on this kind of a chart. So for instance, if you are going to be doing this, an active shooter, the probability is very low, right? Because with all of the thousands of churches across the country, now unfortunately it's becoming more common, but it's still a relative probability is really low. It's a 1. The impact, on this chart, the impact would be the vertical axis. The impact is really high. It can really be devastating, especially if there are multiple fatalities or something like that in your church. It can destroy a church. Okay? Something like child abuse, probability much, much higher. And we can't fool ourselves. It's very apt to happen in your church, if it hasn't already. The impact is pretty high. The impact can really be devastating as well. Probably not as devastating as a shooter who's killed half a dozen people on your campus, but it'll still be very, very devastating to your church. We can't measure the devastation to the child. I mean, think about that one. I hate doing it. Now, here's something that you also need to be aware of. You may say, but, you know, we know our workers and so forth, that's not going to happen. Did you know that the most common child sexual abuse is not by adults, but it's by other older children or teens? So you may think our adult workers are just fine. That's not necessarily where your concern needs to be. So what we do when we do a review, we take the major risks and we put them on a chart like this. And basically we will draw an arc, it'll go something like that, and anything out here, we'll want to make sure that there are some plans being developed to take care of those things. But things that are lower impact and lower probability, put them on the back burner for now. This kind of a graph is really a great way to be able to help prioritize the things that can be a challenge to your church. Okay, here are some of the risks that we typically run into when we are in churches. Obviously, physical damage from a fire or earthquake, emotional or unstable and violent individuals, active shooter, embezzlement, whether it's fraud or outright theft, weak accounting procedures, sexual harassment, abuse and assault, child predators, lost or missing children, medical emergencies, and child custody disputes. It's an area that is often overlooked, where there's a family going through a divorce and one parent is authorized to be able to pick up the child, the other parent is not authorized but wants them, and there are those kinds of issues. Now, this is just a sample of the kinds of things that tend to rise and find themselves outside of that arc that need to be dealt with. I just want to talk briefly about medical emergencies. Know who the people with medical training are in your congregation. Because there will be people, and they will be willing to help in most cases. Now, there are some who just say, no, that's what I do Monday through Friday. I really don't want to be doing that on Sunday. But know who they are. Know the medical people in your congregation. Train staff and key volunteers. Make sure that they are trained to know what to do, to know where AEDs are, to know where first aid kits are, and all of those kinds of things. One of the things that we find that happens all the time when we go to churches and we ask them, do you have an AED? Yeah. Where is it? I don't know. Doesn't do much good. You know, do you have a first aid kit? Yeah. Where is it? I think it's in the office. Is the office open all day Sunday when services are on? Well, no. It's locked. So make sure that staff are trained and they know where things are and how to get to them. Have AEDs on campus. And you need to make sure that the AEDs are accessible. And if you have a campus where, or a church building, if the children's area is either in another building or downstairs or somewhere away from the worship center, there really needs to be an AED over in the children's area. We were just at a church recently, and there was the main building, and they had a nursery, preschool during the week in a separate building that was, maybe 20, 25 yards away from the main building. And they had an AED, and it was in the room closest to that preschool. And we said, well, that's good. I mean, it would be nice if it were a little bit closer to them, but that's good. And then we discovered the only problem was that the room that it was in was always locked during the week when the preschool is open. Not doing any good. So make sure, think through, where are the AEDs and are they accessible? Because many times they'll be there, but they won't be accessible when they need to be accessible. Does the local fire department know where to go if they get a call to your church campus? Because most church campuses have multiple entry points. And if the local fire department doesn't know where to go, they can spend precious minutes trying to figure out where is the problem if they've been called. So what we advise is that, number one, you have a conversation with your local fire department so that they know, and you've had conversations and you have some interaction. But do something like have somebody that's got like a yellow vest. And if there's an emergency, that person grabs that vest and stands out where the fire department will come in, into the parking area or off of the street in front of the church and so forth. They can meet them there and they can point them and tell them exactly where the emergency is. It's a pretty simple protocol to follow. Always make a report and keep a report of any issues that you have in the medical area. Whether it's children or adults, make sure that you keep them, because 3 weeks later, 3 months later, 3 years later, somebody is apt to say, we have a problem and we're going to file a lawsuit. And if you don't have any report that says what happened and what the church did, you could be in big trouble. So make sure that you have a report and keep it. Okay, we want to talk about making your church safe for children. Here is a room that is definitely not safe for children. But we want to make it safe. So you want to create safe facilities. I just was reading an article this morning, actually. I saw it as I was going through emails. And it says, be the church that embraces children, not just tolerates them. It's a great little article. And it says a number of things about how to, how you can know that this is a church that embraces children. And one of them is, embracing children means valuing noise over perfection, which I think is probably appropriate. But it also says embracing children means protection at all costs. It says embracing children means investing in kids' ministry. And that can mean making sure that you are creating safe facilities for them. Safe facilities means that there is limited access. Can anybody walk into your children's areas? It wasn't my partner or myself, it was Mark Barguer who was here earlier, and one Sunday they had been at a church doing some general consulting, not just in the safety area, but he wasn't known in the church, so he thought, well, I'm just going to see how this church responds to things. He walked into the children's area, sat down, nobody approached him, nobody talked to him. Not good. Limited access. Have windows on all doors. Now, if there's a closets, or if there are, lock them. I was in a church once and we were in the nursery area. We opened a closet door and there are all sorts of toys in there, along with cleaning stuff. Make sure that there are accessible toilets. Have age-appropriate safety equipment. So, first aid kits that have Band-Aids that, I mean, this may sound really kind of silly, but if I were doing it, I would make sure that in my children's first aid kit, the Band-Aids all had, you know, cartoon characters or something on it, just so that the kids would like them. You know, why make children not like? As I said earlier, look at the room on your hands and knees. You'll find some things that you will be absolutely amazed at. Get the right ministry volunteers. Make sure that you have an application form. A lot of churches don't do that. They just think, hey, if we got volunteers, I want volunteers. I'm not going to make them fill out an application. Why am I going to make them fill out an application? They might change their mind. But you need to have an application form so that you can do appropriate background checks. And if you aren't doing background checks, you got to get them done. And we even encourage you to repeat them about every 3 years at least. Because you don't know what happened in between. You say, well, you know, somebody's come to the church and they're George's nephew. And we know George, he's a great guy. So do we need to have him fill out an application and do a background check? What's the answer? Yes! I see good things, seeing heads nodding up and down. Because you don't know. And the thing of it is, if something happens because you didn't do the background check on George's nephew, or on anybody for that matter, and they have a situation, or you have a situation where they do something to one of your children, you've lost the lawsuit, basically. That's what it boils down to. Because it's standard operating procedure. If you want to know, well, what are the standards that we should follow in doing background checks, talk to your local school district and find out what they do with teachers and volunteers, and make sure that what you're doing at least meets that standard, and hopefully, if it's possible, exceeds it. Because then you'll be safe. And because then, if you get sued for something, and well, you tell me, which would you rather have to do? Be in court, and when you are questioned in terms of what did you do to protect the children, you say, well, you know, we hire people that we know and we think have good character. Well, do you hire people that have filled out an application? Well, no. Do you hire people without a background check? Well, yeah. Would you rather have to say that, or be able to say, tell us the standards that you have in your church when hiring or accepting volunteers? We follow a standard that exceeds the standards of the public schools in our area. Pretty simple. It's a great defense. Have a 6-month rule. Anybody know what the 6-month rule is?
You don't let anyone work in your children's department unless they've been at your church for more than 6 years. Or 6 months.
6 months, absolutely. And I get all sorts of pushback on this. But we know George's nephew. Make them be there for 6 months before you put them in children's ministry. Doesn't mean that you can't put them other places. Okay, I mean, that's up to your leadership, but not in children's ministry. If for 6 months. Get references. Do a personal interview. And listen carefully to the personal interview. Listen between the lines. And if you have somebody in your congregation who is an HR professional, it's a great idea to have them participate in an interview. Even if they don't ask the questions, even if they're just sitting there as observation, because they'll see things because they do a lot of interviewing. So consider that. Make sure that they understand the 2-adult rule and how you apply it. Because the 2-adult rule is an interesting rule. Public schools, for the most part, do not have a 2-adult rule. Okay, they have 1 adult in a room with 25 kids. Okay? The 2-adult rule really applies. You don't have 1 kid with 1 adult at any time. You can have 1 kid with 2 adults, or you can have 2 or 3 or 4 kids with 1 adult, but not 1 kid with 1 adult. That's dangerous. So different churches will apply that 2-adult rule in some different ways. And sometimes what it means is that you have to have somebody who can roam in order to take some children, so that there will be 2 adults taking a child to the bathroom. You know, so you may have to have an adult who is kind of on call, if you will, to go and help with that. I was at a church in Texas, and this church, it was an interesting church. The pastor was a former police officer, and half of his congregation were ex-convicts. It was a really interesting church. It had wonderful ministry, and they had been able to purchase an old downtown church in the middle of this kind of rural town in Texas, about an hour outside of Houston. And this church had been multiple buildings that they kind of then put roof over what had been walkways between the buildings and turned them into interior hallways. Okay? So you have these interior hallways that are dark and not well lit. And what made it even more interesting was that from the worship center, if you wanted to get to a restroom, you had the choice of going out of the building, walking around on the sidewalk, in one of the doors in one of these hallways, down the hallway to the restroom. Or, right up at the front, on the right-hand side, there was a door that went directly into that hallway, pretty close to the restroom. And I had been there for the weekend, and I was sitting and watching what was going on during the service. And as I'm sitting there, there's a little girl in front of, about 3 rows in front of me, and she gets up and she walks over and she walks up and out that door to the restroom. And I watched, and a few minutes later she comes in, comes back, and sits down. Everything was fine. The next time I sat down with the pastor and his, actually it was his board, his elder board that I was sitting with, I said, when that little girl went out into the hallway, who was there? He said, oh, well, we have a man out there that's watching the hallway. And I said, you got a problem. Because now you've got a little girl walking out and just one man watching her head to the restroom. And they just kind of looked at me with this blank stare. They had never realized that that was going on. I said, now what, you know, and they were kind of like, what do we do? I said, you get a lady in the congregation to sit up about 2 rows from the front, right on the aisle, and any time a little girl goes out that way, she gets up and goes out too. She waits in the hallway when the little girl goes to the restroom. When she comes back in, she comes back in. You have to think about those kinds of things. Those kinds of things, and those are the things, like at this church, They didn't see it. They'd been doing it this way since they started meeting at this church. They just didn't see it. But it was going on all the time. Create safe check-in and check-out procedures. Have a record of who is authorized to pick up the child. Emergency contact information, parent or guardian contact information. Check all IDs when they're coming and going. Create safe policies. Part of the safety team review is to do this. Use things like the 6-month rule, the 2-adult rule, the hands-off rule. Adults should not be, well, let me rephrase that. Male adults should not be touching children. And I even say, female adults, be careful. Okay? Just be really, really careful. Now, there are times, I understand, there are times when a child falls and they hurt themselves and they need to be able to crawl onto somebody's lap and so forth, and that's okay. But you keep an eye on that, because if it keeps happening over and over again, then you've got a problem on your hands. Okay? Just be very, very careful. Make sure that you have a policy about age for youth volunteers. And I think using young people in children's ministry is great, but they need to be trained. You need to have a minimum age. You know, you don't have a 5th grader watching a 3rd grader. You have a junior in high school who's been trained working with a 3rd grader, but you know, there's got to be some separation there, and they've got to be trained and so forth. Know your lockdown process and practices. Here's the thing. You've got a children's area, it's maybe in another building, it's in a wing of the church, it's in the basement, wherever it is. And a problem starts happening, whether it's a shooter or just even a violent intruder or just somebody who's mentally ill and creating a real ruckus in the worship center. You need to know, how do you lock that down so that people, that mentally ill person or somebody else that's causing the problem, can't get into the children's area. And lock it down fast. That's where two-way radios are really important. Because if you have somebody in your worship center who has a two-way radio, you should have people that are greeters out in the parking area with two-way radios, and you should have somebody in your children's area with one of those two-way radios. And the person in the worship center says, we've got a problem here, lock down. The person in the children's area gets that on the radio, bingo, they lock it down. So make sure that you've got some lockdown procedures in place. And one of the things that you'll want to do is go back and look at your doors to see whether or not they lock down very easily. Okay, just check your doors to make sure. Evacuation plan. Do you have an evacuation plan? Now, when you think about an evacuation plan, there are a couple of things to think about. One is, can you get them out through a doorway or an exit where first responders are not trying to come in? Because if they're trying to go out and there are medical people or first responders trying to come in, you've got a traffic jam going there. Now, it may be that that's the only thing you can do, and if it is, it is. But if there are a couple of ways to exit, make sure that you have thought through which is the most likely door that a first responder is coming in, so that you take the children or adults, for that matter, out the other area. The other thing with an evacuation plan, make sure it's posted. A lot of places, there's no posting for an evacuation. And people don't know. But if it's posted, people who are in that room regularly eventually will see it. And, oh, we got an evacuation plan. Oh, okay. Yeah, that means I go out and I go here and so forth. Another thing, make sure that once you get them out of the building, you get them, hopefully, if it's at all possible, at least 150 feet away from the building. Because if it's a fire or an earthquake or something like that, you want them at least that far away from the building. Now, that's not always possible, but get them as far away as you possibly can. But here's the trick with that. You want to get them far away, but you want them in a contained area, especially the children, because you don't want them running all over the place. And you want to make sure that ushers or other adults know where that area is so that they can go and help contain the children. And you want to make sure that parents know that that's where they come to get their children. So that if there's an evacuation, the parents know how to pick up and where to pick up their children. Have the right medical policies and travel policies. This is particularly true for youth mission trips. Make sure that you've got good travel policies and medical policies for mission trip stuff. That's kind of a whole area that's developing. And more case law is being developed because of mission trips, and somebody gets sick on a mission trip and they don't have a policy for getting them back or getting them medical help and so on and so forth, and bad things happen. So make sure that you've got policies in that area. Make sure that you, let me say one more thing, then I'll come right back, because I'm just about done and I will open to questions for the last 10 minutes. Make sure that you know how to respond if there are allegations of child abuse or especially any child abuse. You and your workers, if you're working with children, you are required to report. You're mandated reporters, and your staff needs to know that. And you've got to take that seriously. And you've got to make sure that if you suspect, either within your ministry or if a child comes to your Sunday school or your kids' min, and for 3 weeks in a row they've always come with some kind of an injury, you better report that, because chances are good that some problem is going on at home, and you're a mandated reporter. And leave it up to child services to determine what is the appropriate response. You don't take that into your hands. Call child services and get the right people out there investigating. And that's just so important. And oh, by the way, don't call the parents and tell them that you're reporting them. We had to report somebody at the church a number of years ago, and the parents attended the church, and we didn't really think there was a problem, but this teenage gal had talked about that she had been molested by her brother, and he was away at college, and he was coming home, and she was fearful that she was going to be molested again. And she told this to one of our camp counselors, and they came to me and said, "What do we do?" And I said, "We get on the phone right away and report it." And we did. Child services went out, visited the parents, and the father was really angry with me for reporting it. He said, "Why didn't you come to me?" And I just said, "Well, think about that one for a minute." Just make that call. It's a tough one. There are a whole lot of other things that I could talk about. Let me just say that my partner and myself, Chuck Rogers and myself, who couldn't be here, we're happy to come to churches and do reviews. People say, "Well, does it cost?" And our response to that basically is, we both live in Claremont. If you can give us a small honorarium to cover gas and food, we'll come and walk the campus and talk.